Here we go again. Welcome everyone to the Public Health Improvement webinar. I'm your host, Liliana Johnson with NNPHI, welcoming you to Tips for Becoming a Successful PHAB Applicant with Public Health Accreditation Board, also known as PHAB Accreditation Specialists, Jennifer Jimenez and Marita Chilton. With that, I'm going to leave it to Jennifer and Marita. You're going to hear a lot from these very well-versed accreditation specialists. Jennifer, to you.
Okay, thanks, Lil. Good afternoon, everybody, and for those of you who are out west, like Marita and I, good morning. I just want to thank you all for participating today on this webinar. Like Lil said, you'll be hearing from both Marita and myself. And just so you know why we're on this call today, as in our role, what we do is we provide a lot of support to health departments who are in the process of accreditation. And we provide guidance on, helping health departments to develop documentation and prepare documentation for PHAB, which includes helping them understand what the PHAB standards and measures are asking for, helping to understand what the numbers of examples are being required, as well as the time frames. Acceptable programs is a big question that we get asked quite often. What are the acceptable programs for PHAB? How to present that documentation. Your documentation is really a critical part in demonstrating the evidence, and so you really want to clearly tell your story and ensure that your site visitors are presented with good quality documentation that really demonstrates how a particular measure is being met. Let me advance the slide. Sorry about that. So in our presentation, this is what we'd like to cover. We'd like to provide some suggestions to you for the document selection process, as well as some do's and don'ts when you're preparing your documentation, and then just in general, some tips from Marita and I. We spend a lot of time looking at documentation, and so we've seen a lot of things that might work well, as well as things that could be improved. So these are the 7 steps to PHAB accreditation. Hopefully you're familiar with these. If not, you can find more information about them on the PHAB website. For today's webinar, we're really going to focus on step 3, which is document selection and submission. So to get us started, we'd like to start with a poll. So we'd like to ask you a question. After attending the PHAB Accreditation Coordinator training, and you may know, every health department needs to assign an accreditation coordinator who goes to a training. So after attending that training, how long do you think a health department has to submit their documentation? Is it 1 day? Do you think it's maybe 1 month? Do they have a year? Or, as long as it takes? Does a health department have as long as they want to submit that documentation? I'll give you just a few minutes to go ahead and mark your responses, and then we'll talk about that. So it looks like most everybody's responded with the correct response. Health departments have a year to submit documentation. Some health departments take that full year. Others submit it in a shorter amount of time frame, a shorter time frame. You don't have to take the full year, but you do have that available to you. And again, though, if you want to submit it sooner, that's okay too. Some of you responded as long as you want. I think, at some point we do have to have a cutoff. So our cutoff is that 1 year. So I just want to show you a timeline because I think there is some unknowns about how long things take. So we just talked about, with that first box, the health department has a year to submit documentation. After a health department submits their documentation, then the PHAB staff do what we call a completeness review. That usually takes a couple of weeks, and what we're looking for is just some basic information Can we open your documents? Does it have a date on it? Did you provide 2 examples as required? Just simple things like that. For any measures where we do see issues, we'll open up those measures and send some requests back to the health department. The health department has 30 days to respond to those requests. And again, you don't have to take the full 30 days, but you do have that available to you. But it's after that we get that response, then a site visit team is assigned to the health department. The site visit team will do what we call a pre-site visit review of the documentation. And during this process, the team is looking for any areas where they need clarification, any areas where they think additional documentation might be needed. But this is their first review of all of the documentation that you've submitted to PHAB. And it takes a while. I mean, you submit a lot of documentation, so it's going to take them a bit to go through this. Usually it takes teams about 8 to 10 weeks. So once they've compiled all of their requests for additional information that they would like from you or from the health department, we then send it to the health department, and again, the health department has 30 days to respond to those requests. After PHAB receives the response from the health department, a site visit is scheduled about 3 weeks out after that. So given all of these different steps that are involved in terms of submitting and reviewing documentation both on PHAB's part as well as the site visit team, and as well as the response times for health departments, it's usually about 6 months after a health department submits their documentation that they're looking at a site visit. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit of what's involved in terms of timing. So let's move on to talking about selecting documentation. As we just saw, we set a lot of time aside for reviewing the documentation, so you want to make sure that you're doing a thorough job of pulling together and organizing your documentation. As you know, there's a lot of measures that you have to submit documentation for, so because of that, it would be pretty difficult for a single person to pull everything together. So we strongly suggest that you do this as a team. And with a broad team, we think you'll be better able to assess your options in terms of what documentation is available to you, as well as what would work best for each of the measures. So if you're the accreditation coordinator, you may want to break up your larger team into smaller teams and have each group be responsible for a certain section of the standards and measures. It's also helpful if you can have a central location where all your documents get pulled together. We don't prescribe how you have to do this. We leave it up to you. So whether you want to use a particular software program to organize your documentation, or if you want to set up folders on your shared drive, it's totally up to you. We just suggest that you use what you have available to you and what's going to work best for your health department. Some health departments, we found, wait to pull all of their documentation together internally before they start uploading anything into e-PHAB, and this is fine, but we do just want you to know that if you wanted to upload documents into e-PHAB as you go, you are able to make changes, including deleting documents, as much as you'd like up until you officially submit that documentation to PHAB. So we talked a little bit about who and a little bit about how when selecting documentation. Now let's talk about the what. As a team, you want to make sure that as you're considering documentation, you make sure that you choose documents that really reflect what you do as a health department. So for example, you may have received a one-time grant to work on a project that you know will not be funded again. Does this really reflect what you do on a regular basis in your health department? Probably not. So you want to try to select documents that do reflect typical operations of your health department. This probably sounds like a no-brainer, but you want to make sure that you select documentation that meets what the required documentation section is asking for. So within each measure, there's at least one, if not more, required documentation sections. So you want to make sure you read those sections carefully and make sure that the documentation you're considering has all of those elements required. You also want to take a look at the bigger pictures and make sure that the documentation aligns with the intent of the measure, but also the standard and the domain that you happen to be working on. And then finally, you want to make sure that the documentation you're pulling together comes from a variety of programs that you have in your health department. You really want to paint a picture of the depth and breadth of your programs and services. So if you only select documentation from your immunization and your tobacco control programs, we really won't get that broad perspective. So try to highlight all the great things that you're doing in your health department to the extent possible. So some nuts and bolts about selecting documentation. As you probably know, we do everything electronically, so all documents have to be uploaded in our e-PHAB system. We don't look at any hard copy documents. Anything you provide to us must be valid and in use when you submit your documentation. So you may have a contract that's coming up for renewal about the time that you're thinking of submitting your documentation. If that contract expires before you submit everything to us, we wouldn't consider it to be current and in use. So if you have something like that, we would advise you to select some other documentation. We also look at draft documents as not being used or not being final documents. So make sure that everything you submit is in final form. Also, documents should not be submitted with confidential information. If you have documentation that has such information that you really want to use, make sure that you somehow conceal that information, whether you black it out or somehow just make sure that it's not something that can be seen. For those of you who might be using version 1.0 of the standards and measures, you should know that for each section within a measure, the default for the number of required examples is 2, and the default time frame is 5 years. There are several measures that do have different requirements, so you have to read the language carefully to determine when there's different time frames or different numbers of examples required. We also have a list of acceptable file formats that can be used for documentation that can be found on our website. In general, we accept Microsoft file types as well as some audio and video file types. I will say our preference is that you use PDF files as much as possible. We seem to have the least issues with PDF files. They're cleaner, they open easily, and they're just easier to navigate through, especially if you're uploading large documents. And they have some neat features that you can use to call out different parts of your documentation. So, and that one question we get is, can documentation be used for more than one measure? And the answer is yes. In fact, in some cases you may have to. Some health departments have their community health assessment and community health improvement plan in one single document. So if that's the situation you're in, you'll likely need to upload it into more than one measure. We talked about just a little while ago each measure requiring 2 examples. And in order to meet this, you may need to provide more than one document per example. So it's important not to confuse the number of examples with the number of documents. So if you need to show evidence that you held a meeting with community partners, you might submit a sign-in sheet as well as meeting notes. And while these might be in 2 separate documents, together they are one example. So if you needed to show 2 examples of this, you may need to upload 2 sign-in sheets and 2 examples of meeting notes to meet the 2 required examples. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, send us a question through the chat feature and we'll try to address that. So the site visit team will be looking at all of your documentation, and you want to make sure that as a whole it shows continuity. So when going through the standards and measures, you may find that there may be things in measure requirements that you may not have primary responsibility for, but you are involved with them somehow. So if that's the case, to meet some of those measures, we're less concerned about who developed the documentation. What we really want to see is that the measure requirements are being met, and we want you to show us how you're involved with making sure that those requirements are being met. So if you're not the lead on, let's say, your Access to Care Coalition, and it's actually led maybe by one of your community partners, maybe you can show us that you're an active participant on that coalition. Or another example, you may have a contractor that carries out a measure requirement. So you could potentially submit your contract with them that describes what they do and how it meets the measure requirements. And then the same goes for some of the other examples on the slide. You want to be able to show us an agreement or some other evidence that you're working with others to carry out those measure requirements that you may not have lead responsibility for. So an important part of pulling together documentation is having good attention to detail. And I think this is one of my favorite slides because it shows a lot of the things that we look for in our completeness review. I think if you can make sure that your documentation doesn't have these errors listed on this slide, then you would be off to a good start in terms of preparing your documentation. So you want to make sure that your document is dated. Everything needs to have a date on it, whether it's the month, the day, and the year, or the month and the year, or just a year. You need to have dates on everything that you upload. These can also be published or created dates, revision dates, excuse me, or even dates that the documentation was reviewed. We talked about drafts a little while ago. Again, draft documents will not be reviewed by site visitors. Blank signature lines. It's always interesting to me when I see documentation with blank signature lines. If it's not signed, then your reviewer is led to believe that this isn't a final document. And if it's not a final document, it's not something that can be reviewed for that measure. So if you have documents that have signature lines within them, make sure there is a signature on them. One of your jobs in pulling together your documentation is to make things as easy as possible for your site visitors. So please don't make them read anything that's upside down. It's not easy, especially if you have a 30-page document that's all upside down. It would be really frustrating to have to review. So, one of the things you can do is as you upload your documents, take the time to open them up and make sure that they're uploaded right side up. Screenshots is another thing in another area where we see some errors with. So anytime you submit a screenshot as documentation, you want to make sure that you include some things with that. You want to make sure that within the document that has the screenshot, you include the date that the screenshot was taken, because this is going to be the date that's used to make sure that you're meeting the correct time frame requirement. And you also want to provide some context to your screenshot. So tell the site visitors what they're looking at. And then, finally, just make sure you're providing sufficient examples, but at the same time, don't provide excess documentation just to cover your bases. Your site visitor shouldn't have to look through multiple examples to find the two that are appropriate for the measure.
Jennifer, this is Lil. Can I ask a few questions that have come in?
Okay, sure.
All right. One is it possible to use a health department logo as a substitute of a signature in documentation?
It is. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And in a couple of slides, I will show you that. So yes.
Okay, well, just tell me if some of these questions you'll get to. Just a couple more. So when you were talking about the timeline and, kind of the 7 steps in your previous slide, is the letter of intent what triggers access to e-PHAB?
The statement of intent. So, yes. In order to submit a statement of intent, you will have to register in e-PHAB. So yes, you will have access to e-PHAB in a limited capacity once you submit your statement of intent. And what will happen is, once you submit your statement of intent and it's approved by PHAB, then you have access to complete the next step, which is the application. And so once you do that, as you go through the different steps, you get more access in e-PHAB as you go along.
Thanks. And I guess last thing I'll ask right now, and we'll keep on holding those other questions that have come in, is can you talk a little bit more about continuity versus across the department and how it relates to documentation selection?
Oh, let's see if we maybe get to that with the rest of the slides, and if not, we can come back to it.
Sure. Okay. I'll leave it to you then.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have another question for you. Which of the following documents do not have to adhere to the time frame requirements? And we talked about, the default time frame requirement being 5 years unless it's, stated otherwise. But do any of these documents listed here not have to adhere to the time frame requirements? And could that be a brochure, the meeting minutes, policies, state and local statutes, or maybe none of the above? Let us know what you think. All right, just about 3 more seconds. Okay, so the correct answer for this question is actually none of the above. And I see a lot of people selected state and local statutes, and I realize it's probably because you may not have control over those, and we do realize that. So what we tell health departments is that for those items where you don't have control over, and it could be policies as well, what you could provide to us if it doesn't fall within that correct time frame is evidence that you as a department have spent some time looking at those statutes and or the policies within the last 5 years or within the last 3 years, whatever the time frame requirement happens to be. So you've taken a look at it to make sure that you're still following those policies or those statutes appropriately, and that it's still working for you as a health department, and identify areas where maybe you need to improve. But because they may not fall within the correct time frame, it doesn't lift that particular requirement. You still need to show something, some sort of evidence that you've reviewed those documents within the appropriate time frames and that you're accurately following them still. So just a little bit more about dates and signatures. As you're pulling together your documentation, look at your policies, look at your procedures and your plans, and make sure that they are dated somehow, and whether that's the date they were created or reviewed, make sure that there is some sort of date on there. Also make sure that there's some evidence that these documents belong to you or that you were involved with them somehow. So that could be the health department's logo. It could be your health director's signature. Maybe it's your health department name or letterhead. Email addresses can serve as a signature as well. I would just recommend that you highlight them and provide some explanation of who the email addresses belong to so that the site visitor knows. Maybe if you're not the lead on a particular coalition, but you're on the members, you're member of that coalition, if you submit a membership list where you indicate who from your health department is part of that membership, that could also serve as a signature. And just to my point earlier, do your best to make the review as easy as possible on your site visit team. Make sure everything you upload is legible, and when possible, use PDF documents. And then check your documentation after you've uploaded it to see how it opens for you. I'm going to move quickly through this. This is the acceptable file format that we use for documentation. This list is available on our website. So if you have any questions, you can look there. Another quick question, and we'll just spend a few seconds on this and go over the last area that I'm going to cover with you today, but which of the following program areas is not an area covered by PHAB? Do you think it's injury prevention, substance abuse, access to clinical services, WIC, or communicable disease? Okay, I'm going to rush you guys through this one just to make sure we get through these. Okay. It looks like for the most part, everybody, you've selected the right one. Substance abuse is, the area that is not considered a program covered by PHAB. So let's move on and we'll talk a little bit about programs. The focus of PHAB standards and measures is on population-based disease prevention, health protection, and health promotion. Our standards address a range of core public health programs and activities such as those listed here. A couple of other program examples might include infectious disease control, as well as vital records and statistics. I underlined the word access here in this first bullet because what we're looking for with clinical services is that the health department assesses availability of services and or helps address gaps in those services, but we're not looking for documentation that health departments provide the actual services because we don't ask for documentation about one-on-one services or personal services. So I just wanted to make sure that we're looking at access but not the actual clinical services. What our standards and measures don't address are social or human services. We realize that some health departments do provide mental health or substance abuse, primary care type services, but these are not, what we consider core public health services under the 10 Essential Services framework that is used for accreditation purposes. Our scope of accreditation does not extend to these areas, so documentation from these program areas generally won't be accepted for PHAB accreditation. Similarly, documentation from healthcare facilities, professional licensing programs, and the administration of healthcare financing systems can't be used for public health department accreditation purposes. And again, your health department may be responsible for some of these areas, but you just wouldn't want to submit documentation from these areas for PHAB. For those of you who might be using version 1, again, the default for number of examples is 2. We realize it's not always easy to interpret this. It's also not always easy to understand what the time frame requirements are, but we've cleared this up with version 1.5. But anyone using version 1.0, if you're uncertain about what the requirements are, just check with the PHAB staff. Let's see. There's just to call out some measures where there's only going to be one example required. That might be the measure with the community health assessment, or where we ask for policies and procedures. You may have all of your policies and procedures in one comprehensive document, so you may only need to submit one document. If, however, your policies are separate, then you should provide 2 separate examples. So pay attention to those measures where we ask for examples from different program areas also, because some measures will ask for a program and an administrative example. Some measures will ask for 2 program examples, one of which must be from a chronic disease prevention area. So read the requirements carefully. And again, if you have any questions, you can always contact us. Earlier this year, we released version 1.5 of the standards and measures. We began using this version with health departments that applied to PHAB after June 2nd. They're not drastically different from version 1.0, but there are some significant improvements in this version. I think my favorite improvement is that we've added columns throughout the document that explicitly indicates how many examples are required and what the time frame requirements are. Also, based on feedback we received from the field, we also clarified several of the measures by modifying language and providing more examples throughout. This is just a picture of what one of the measures looks like in the new standards and measures. Still looks very similar, but you'll see those 2 new columns that I just mentioned over on the right. And then the final thing I just want to mention before I turn it over to Marita is that as you're pulling together your documentation, you want to make sure that it meets the requirements under the required documentation and guidance sections. But you also want to develop your documentation or select it in light of the domain and the standard that you're focusing on. So ask yourself as you're pulling together documents, does it match up with the requirements? If you're unsure, look more broadly to the measure purpose and significance to get a better understanding. You may have to go a little bit further to the standard and domain language a couple of times as well. It's a lot to think about, and you want to make sure that you do take sufficient time to give thought to this when pulling together your documentation so that you can present the best evidence that you have. So with that, let me turn it over to Marita.
Thanks, Jennifer. So once you have your documentation selected, there's going to be several ways that you can point the site visit team to the relevant information. So let's take another poll. How could a health department direct the site visitor to relevant information in the documentation? Email the site visitor, highlight the relevant areas in the document, use bookmarks or notes in PDF documents, or use the upload description in e-PHAB to direct the reviewer to specific pages. There's more than one correct answer, so check as many as apply here. Just give you a few more seconds. All right, it looks like most of you got it absolutely correct. You can highlight relevant areas, use bookmarks or notes, and use the upload description in e-PHAB. All of those are correct answers. During the process, a department won't be emailing a site visitor at all. There won't be any direct contact up until the actual site visit occurs. All of the communication is going to be mediated through PHAB, through your accreditation specialist. So it's really important to provide that context to the site visitors. And while you may be familiar with your department's documentation, as you're going through, try to imagine that this is the first time that you've seen it. You'll need to help the reviewer see what you see by highlighting and providing notes within the documentation, as well as using features in e-PHAB such as the title, description, and measure narrative to direct the site visitor and show why you're uploading the document for that particular measure. So let's take a closer look at each of these areas. Before you upload documents in e-PHAB, use whatever system makes sense to you within the document to point to the relevant portions of text that meet the requirements. You can use arrows, underline, to put a box around the text. If you're using PDF, it does have those great features where you can use notes and flags. You could insert a big red star next to the relevant section, whatever makes sense to you, so that when a site visitor views the document, they know where you want them to look. So as Jennifer mentioned, PDF documents are preferred in e-PHAB. You'll notice when you start uploading your documents that they upload a lot more quickly than other formats, and they also download more quickly, nice for the site visitors who are reviewing all of your documentation. And while there are other document formats that PHAB accepts, as you saw the list, please do make sure the format is an acceptable file type before uploading it. So as Jennifer also mentioned, you can use the same piece of documentation in more than one measure as long as it meets the requirements. There is no limit to how many times you can use the same piece of documentation. Do you remember that the site visitors want to see a variety of program examples? So when you're using the same piece of documentation, remember to flag or highlight the portions of that document that's relevant to the measure where it's being uploaded. Within e-PHAB, there are 3 additional places where you'll be able to provide context about your documentation to site visitors. You have a required document title and then optional document descriptions and measure narratives. Site visitors are trained to take a close look at these, and we've heard feedback that site visitors really appreciate when departments use each of these features thoughtfully. Here's a screenshot of the upload feature in e-PHAB. As you can see, there's a text field for the title and the document description. You'll upload files just like you would add an email attachment. You'd select Browse, find the file on your system, and upload it into e-PHAB. The title field is going to be required for every upload. The title will not automatically populate your system's file name for the document, and this is actually a good thing. It gives you the opportunity to provide a concise name for the document so that the site visitors know what they're about to read. This also means that if you have internal naming convention for your documents, you don't need to change that system for PHAB accreditation. Just make sure that when you're preparing your documents, you also prepare a title for each. There is a 250 character limit for this field. We ask that you not use any special characters in the title field. It confuses the system if you use lots of special characters and underscores and stuff. So try to just use letters, numbers, and spaces as much as possible. So here are some example file titles. Obesity Coalition Minutes, May 2014. You'll notice that all of these titles are easy to understand and just state what the document is. If the document is from a coalition or partnership where the acronym might not be known outside of your jurisdiction or your state, you'll want to spell it out. Remember to try to look at the document like this is the first time you've seen it. The description box is available for each upload. This is an optional text field you can use to help provide the link between the requirements and the uploaded document for the site visitor. This box has a 150 word limit and appears as a hover over. So you can use this feature to describe how your documents demonstrate conformity, identify specific locations within the document, such as the page number, provide context if it's a part of a larger document, or you can type here who created the document if it wasn't your department. So here's an example of a file description. Notice that the description identified that the hospital representative provided the minutes. In addition, the description tells the site visitors they should look at page 2 for the strategies and the highlighted sections on page 3 and 4 for how the department was involved. So even when you do highlight or mark your document in some way, it's also a good idea to note the page numbers that are highlighted within the document description. You especially want to do this in large documents. Also, many measures have more than one required element. So you can see in this description that the department identified both where the strategies could be found and where information related to the department's involvement was located. So identifying where each of the required elements can be found really helps the site visitors move through their review quickly and efficiently. So here's a screenshot of what documents look like in e-PHAB after they've been uploaded. This view is the same for the department and for the site visitors. So you can see that e-PHAB automatically creates a numbering convention for your documents. It's in the first column there. So there's no need to add the measure number to your actual title. Also, take note of the yellow box. This is the upload description. So it appears as a hover over when you put your mouse over the title. And because this is a hover over, information can't be copy and pasted or clicked on. So remember not to include any links to website in your document description. Also, because of how this information is displayed, you'll want to keep the information you enter succinct and relevant to the document it relates to. There is no limit on the number of uploads for each measure in e-PHAB. However, please be mindful that when there's a specific number of examples required, that's how many PHAB and the site visitors are going to review. So for instance, if 2 examples are required, just provide 2 examples. Uploading extra examples is just likely to confuse your site visit team and generally will not be to your benefit. Let's take a look at the measure narrative section. Here's what this text field looks like in e-PHAB. This is going to be an optional text field, but use it thoughtfully to provide context to your site visitors. You'll want to use the measure narrative to explain your reason for selecting all of the documents that you used for that measure. This can provide additional context. It can describe how the evidence together demonstrates conformity, and it helps explain why the department selected the documents. So the size limit here is going to be 10,000 characters, but we strongly suggest not using the entire space, about 4 pages of text. A simple paragraph or 2 about how the documents taken together demonstrate the measure is going to be most helpful to reviewers. Here's example narratives. So what I want you to note from these are that the examples don't just list what documents were provided, and they don't give this fluffy narrative praising the work that's being done. Instead, what they do is they describe how the documents that were provided are in conformity with the measure. So it's time for another quiz. Which of the following statements is false? A department can revise and edit documentation until official submission in e-PHAB. A department can claim a mulligan in one domain, and a mulligan is a golf term for a do-over. Or submitted docs cannot be replaced. Just take a minute. All right, it looks like most of you have responded, and you've responded correctly in most cases. So a department can revise and edit documentation, including your prerequisites, until your official submission in e-PHAB. Also, once submitted, documentation cannot be replaced or deleted. And even though we don't have a provision for mulligans or do-overs, PHAB does have several points in the process where additional information might be requested. So let's take a look at those. So as Jennifer ran through on the timeline, after a department submits its documentation through e-PHAB, PHAB staff conducts a completeness review. And while we don't assess the documents to see if they're in conformity with the measure, we do look to make sure there's a sufficient type and quantity of documentation provided. After that, or after the department responds to any request PHAB has, the site visitors review the documentation prior to the site visit. And they'll also have the opportunity to seek clarification through questions and requests for additional documentation. So these questions and requests will come to the department in one batch, and the department will have 30 days to respond. One note that I do want to make is that any documentation you upload needs to be created prior to your submission date in e-PHAB. So keep that in mind when you're getting those responses. And the site visitors also have an opportunity to reopen measures during the site visit if they have a request for an additional document. And as you go through the process, PHAB's going to provide additional information about what to expect at each of these steps. So I know we aren't spending a lot of time on it today, but we do have other webinars, tip sheets, and trainings that relate to this information here. So when you have questions, PHAB and our partners are all here to help you. PHAB staff is happy to answer all of your questions related to the intent and interpretation of the standards and measures, questions about the format and types of documentation, maybe questions related to the accreditation process or PHAB materials, and all questions related to e-PHAB. To stay up to date on the latest questions that are being asked, I do suggest signing up for PHAB's e-newsletter. All of our most frequently asked questions we add into the newsletter so that everyone can see the responses. Also, after you register in e-PHAB and begin your statement of intent, PHAB provides process support to each department, and you'll officially receive an assigned accreditation specialist after your department submits the application and attends PHAB's accreditation coordinator training. So we also provide process support to all of our site visitors. And becoming a volunteer PHAB site visitor is a great way to give back to the field of public health and learn about the accreditation process from the reviewer's perspective. So to learn more and register to become a volunteer site visitor, you can visit www.e-phab.org, and that's e-PHAB's website. PHAB also works really closely with our partners who provide excellent technical assistance when preparing for accreditation. So look to these partners for resources, templates, advice, and consultation. They have a lot of great resources out there that you can use. So lastly, I want to just go over some general do's and don'ts while you're preparing your documentation. You heard most of these throughout, or all of these throughout the presentation, but I just kind of want to highlight them. So on the do side, if you're uploading a document with a web link, make sure to include a dated screenshot and a description. You'll want to do this so that the site visitors can see a static image at the time your documentation was uploaded. Triple check to make sure every document is dated and includes evidence of authenticity. These are going to be your logos and your signatures. The date, you just need one date on there. You don't need a created and a revised and a this and a that. If you have more than one date, that's fine. But PHAB and the site visitors are going to look for the one that you want us to use. So if there is more than one, you might want to highlight the appropriate date showing that you're within the time frame. Remember that the default number of examples is 2 per required documentation. And really important, you want to make sure to tell your story using your upload title, description, and measure narrative, because you're going to want to point the site visitors in the right direction. One question I saw pop up that I'd include in this do list has to do with the continuity question. You want to make sure that as you're uploading that you don't upload documents that contradict each other. So you want to show how a process or a procedure works across your department. If you upload, for example, a policy on how to create press releases, then you want to make sure that any actual press releases that you're uploading as examples follow that policy. So that's what we mean when we talk about continuity across your documentation. Now for some don'ts. Draft documents are not accepted, so just don't upload them. Don't upload sideways documents. As you saw from the one slide, it's annoying to try to read things sideways. That said, you can upload things in landscape view, but the text itself needs to be legible. So you try opening that document after it's uploaded in e-PHAB and make sure that you can read everything. Web links will not open in the document description or measure narrative. So again, if you want to include a web link, remember to put it in a Word document or a PDF with a dated screenshot and a description. Don't upload documents with blank signature lines. So this is different than when we talk about evidence of authenticity. What we're talking about here is that if an MOU or meeting minutes or other document has a signature line, has a black space written across the bottom, where when the document was created it was intended that someone should sign on that line, you need to make sure that there's an actual signature there. If you don't have that black line in your document where someone would be signing it, then you don't need to worry about having a physical signature. A logo or name of the health department, other evidence of authenticity works. Don't include examples from unacceptable programs or activities. The site visit team will not review these documents. There's a lot of confusion out there about what PHAB accepts and what we don't. And so as you come across specific questions or you have programs where you are really confused about what part of WIC counts and what doesn't, please email PHAB. We're happy to take all of your questions. A lot of times it's easier to answer those one-on-one because we'll be looking at the specific measure. A lot of it is very specific to what domain and what measure you're looking at. Don't upload unacceptable file formats. And as a reminder, the list of acceptable file formats and additional guidance on PHAB acceptable programs and activities can be found on PHAB's website in the Accreditation Materials section. Here's our contact information.
Great. Marita and Jennifer, I'm going to jump right in. Thank you so much. We have a slew of questions. So I'm going to start out with kind of clumping some together, and it's really around what program areas are acceptable, are there definitions of these program areas, and some other issues such as, well, in 2015 we won't have a maternal and child health program in our department. What do we do then? And can you talk a little bit about environmental health programs if they're acceptable?
So I'll go ahead and start. This is Jennifer. The acceptable programs question is something that I realize has caused a lot of confusion for a lot of people. There are a lot of programs where we will take some documentation for, but for some things we won't take documentation for. And I apologize, I had to run through this when I was going through acceptable programs. But we are in the process of updating our guidance on acceptable programs. I think once it comes out, you'll see that it's a lot clearer than it was before. And it will go through and give you different scenarios of when a program is acceptable and when it isn't. For now, we do have a tip sheet on our website that explains what the programs are that are acceptable and which ones aren't. But again, if you have any questions, please contact us and we can help walk you through that. Like Marita just said, sometimes it depends on the measure or again, the type of documentation that you're submitting. So if you contact us, we can help walk you through that and better understand and make sure that what you're submitting is appropriate. With regards to the question about losing your MCH program in next year, I guess, PHAB doesn't say what programs you must have within your health department. So if you're losing that program, you may be able to meet measures with other documentation. Or if you want to still show that, that MCH services or the program is still going on in your community, maybe you are involved with that, whoever is taking it over. So if you wanted to show your involvement and if it's appropriate for a particular measure, then you could do that. And just think back to how, when I talked about how you would do that. So maybe you're part of a coalition for maternal and child health activities. So can you show that you're part of that coalition? Environmental public health activities and services are definitely part of PHAB accreditation. I don't know if there was something more about that question, but yes, the answer is yes to environmental public health. Marita, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was great. The only thing I would add is that for those people that ask specific questions, I know many of you did, please do email us those, or Lil, if it's possible for us to get a copy of the questions with the person who asked. We're happy to just respond to those one-on-one, that we will make sure everyone's questions are answered.
Yeah, it was a specific program, but we can follow up. So a couple other questions around documentation. So one example is, what if a contract has been expired, but it's the contract that the health department is still operating under, and it's only expired because of the time frame needed to get all the signatures on a new contract? Could that be used as documentation? even though it's expired technically?
So I'll jump in there. For expired contracts, we say that they're not current and in use. So no, you would not want to use that as an example. You would want to make sure that you make sure your contract is up to date before you submit your documentation to PHAB. Or I know for some contracts there's provisions put in there saying that when the contract expires, it'll automatically renew for X number of years. Things like that would be fine, but there does need to be documentation, actual documentation, more than just because we said so, that the contract is actually still in use.
Great. And to follow up on that, is that also the case even if the health department doesn't really have any control over a policy or updating those policies?
Yes, so for updating policies and things, if you don't have control, maybe they're controlled by the state or someone else, same thing with statutes and laws, the department will want to make sure that you've reviewed that policy or law within the time frame and that it is still being followed. In cases like that, then a formal memo from a department director with a signature or something like that would suffice as documentation. If you find something as you're going through that review where you say, whoa, we don't do it like this anymore, or maybe this isn't the best way we should do it anymore, what you'll want to do then is show that you're taking steps as a department to work with the state or work with whoever controls that policy or statute to try to get it updated to be what is actually happening in your community.
Great. Quick question on the time frame. So are meeting minutes from about 10 years ago, could that be counted as part of the process?
No, and I'm sorry if there was any confusion about that. Our time frame requirements, the default is going to be 5, so really nothing should be older than 5 years. But again, for other measures, there may be different time frame requirements. We have a few different ones. One is a 3-year time frame. We also have a 24-month time frame or 2-year time frame. And then for those measures that require annual documentation, we're looking for documents that were developed within the last 14 months. So something that is 10 years old would be too old for PHAB accreditation.
Great. And we have reached the hour. I'm wondering if on the PHAB website there is an online orientation for PHAB. And if Jennifer and Marita, would you point folks to that resource for more information? Or what resource would you point people to?
Absolutely, that's a great resource, and we're actually coming out with a new version of that very soon that also includes some additional information for version 1.5. And it's really where you are in the process that depends on where I would point someone at that point in time. So if anyone ever gets stuck or ever just wonders, where should I go next to learn more about the process, feel free to reach out to us. That's what the Accreditation Specialist team is here for. We're here to help your department move along through the process.
Well, thank you so much. You all have very good questions, and Marita and Jennifer, deeply appreciate all the information that you shared today. We'll get this out soon, and people have been asking about slides, so as soon as I stop this meeting, you should be able to fill out the webinar evaluation and see the slides to the right. Thank you, especially to Marita and Jennifer at PHAB for presenting today. Have a good one, everyone. Bye.